Showtime! Well, almost. This upcoming weekend marks the Little Loop debuting at a train show near Portland, Oregon. For these last few weeks leading up to the show, I'm obviously really focused on finishing up the layout and working out any problems it may have before the deadline. But there's also something fun that I would like to do before the show. I love painting engines, and I think it would be a fun treat for those of you who actually make it to the show to see a few surprises on the layout. For example, a couple of geared engines. I got this Shay and Climax for only $50 as a pairing. Now, they weren't perfect, I did have to repair some gear issues, and at this point in time, the Climax really isn't running, but the Shay's doing fine and both of them have DCC and sound. That's a pretty good deal if you ask me. Flexing aside, though, the Shay actually ran into an interesting problem. As you might notice from the background footage, the Shay stalls a lot. Now, we could fix this issue with a current keeper or a keep alive or something, but part of the problem is bumps in the track lifting her wheels enough for her to lose power. Or sometimes she'd just derail. Regardless of the keep alive, if we want to run anything outside of the trench locomotives on a consistent basis, the track needs fixing. The fix was pretty easy. Find a problematic joint, lift the lower set of rails using a pair of pliers until both of the rails are level, and that's it. I didn't really record any of this because I had just fixed the Shay and I really wanted to see her running. I also didn't think it would matter much. Boy, was I wrong. On one joint in the track, I kinda screwed things up big time. You see this joint here? Well, if you look closely, the front rail has a tiny gap between it and the ties. That, my friends, is a rail I pulled on so hard that it pulled itself off of the ties. My main goal was to reduce derailments, not cause more. Yeah, we're screwed. The new bump is so bad that even Snickerdoodle and Peppermint derail on it. We desperately need to fix this. The best thing I could do at this point was to run to my father for advice. His suggestion was that we rip out and replace the broken track piece entirely. We did toss around some other ideas, but because the broken piece of track was a standard piece of track rather than flex track, rip and replace just seemed most practical to us. So, we got to work. First came the rip. To help loosen everything up, we used some alcohol to dissolve the matte medium holding down the ballast. After that had a little bit of time to soak, we came through with a poker to scrape away the pieces that were still stuck to the roadbed, then came back with a vacuum and sucked up all the loose bits. After repeating this process enough times, we could then use a putty knife to get under the track and pull it away from the caulk, holding it in place. To get the broken track off the layout without damaging the track around it, my father cut into the rails with a Dremel. Once he was done cutting, it was pretty easy to pull everything out in pieces. With the track removed, we then focused on cleaning up any leftover caulk or ballast so that the new piece of track would have a smooth surface to sit on. We also sanded down the space to flatten out any last imperfections. Getting the new piece of track in place was a little stressful. We had to put a lot of pressure on all the pieces involved just to get the rail joiners to fit, but with a little bit of patience and some temporary track bending, we were able to just slot everything together in one go. Things were looking good for a moment. That moment, however, quickly died when we did a test run with the Shay. The other piece of track in the problem joint had also been raised in the initial incident, making a little hump at the joint. The Shay, which had some low-hanging detail, was not happy with this hump. To hold the rail down, we just used a clothing pin like a real railroad spike. This didn't just hold the rail down, though, it also held the rail in place. The original joint in the rails wasn't smooth, and so trains running through it also had to deal with a little bit of lateral turbulence on top of the hump. And that seemed to fix everything. I lied, it didn't. While engines were handling the track okay now, the height wasn't quite right and the bump was uncoupling cars on occasion. Instead of using pins, we tried raising the new piece of track to match the old piece's height by adding some thin strips of styrene beneath the ties. This didn't actually work. While the rails were at the same height at the joint, both tracks were at enough of a grade going up to the joint that the peak was still there. Eventually, we just added more pins in a couple of better strategic locations, and that seemed to fix the issue. The only downside of using these pins is that their heads stuck out like a sore thumb with how shiny they were. But with a little bit of brown paint, they blended in perfectly with the ballast. You can still spot them if you know to look for them, but most people won't be able to tell the difference. Speaking of ballast, to round out today's project, we had to add a new layer of ballast. This was both for the scenery, as the tracks look wrong without the ballast, but also to secure the track since we didn't actually glue down the new piece. On the outside of the rails, we just used Elmer's glue to attach the ballast. For the inside, however, we laid the ballast first, sprayed it in half water and half 70% alcohol, then poured on a 1:6 diluted matte medium solution. The alcohol and water helped the matte medium settle between the individual pieces of ballast better. And while we're working on the scenery, I also added a little bit of grass to this corner of the layout. I left this region untouched because the original idea was to do an engine shed here, but that kind of fell through. One, the shed needed to get under the tracks to be assembled correctly, and we did not prepare for this. And two, the walls of the shed would block the view of any locomotives we put on display in this area. So, a little bit of static grass, a little bit of ground foam, and bam! No shed, but no problems either. Aside from missing a tree or two, this area is looking pretty nice. But it's not really what we're here for today. Let's do another test run. Well, would you look at that? I know there's still more scenery to build for the show this weekend, but thank heavens this is out of the way, right? Speaking of the show, I am really excited for it. I already know there's a couple of community members who are going to be showing up. And hey, those secret engines that I've teased you with, now that we've fixed the track issues, they're not gonna derail anymore, right? The layout is actually almost done at this point. The pace of these YouTube videos, though, can't quite keep up with how fast we're building the layout, so even though the show is this weekend, don't expect us to stop uploading videos about this layout anytime soon. With that all said, thanks for watching. I'll see some of you all at the show later this week. Cheers, folks.